afternoon, salam alaikum, and ya ali madad to all of our friends joining. A huge thank you to our terrific panel today. These are people who I consider friends, colleagues, mentors, shining lights on the road to shalom. And the reason I use the word shalom is because one of the interpretations and definitions is wholeness. And today we're going to be talking in so many ways about wholeness, about the role that faith communities and faith leaders, like the ones we have with us, play in our spiritual care, and they also play in our physical and our community care. There is in Islam a frequently used phrase, deen and dunya, the spirit life and the physical life. And in Islam, as in all faith traditions, both of those dimensions of our lives are very important. I want to say a welcome and a thank you to Reverend Jim Wallis, to Dr. Kameelah Rashad, to Rabbi Brad Hirschfield, to Reverend Otis Moss. I want to say in a very personal way, I can't imagine a more critical role in our world this past year and this next year than faith leader, right? You have taken care of people's physical selves, even and after the point of passing into the next world. You have provided spiritual care over screens. You have sat in suffering. You have done laments. I want to say a huge, huge thank you. Those of us who view ourselves in some ways as followers of your congregations, in some ways literally and in some ways figuratively, we appreciate the light that you have cast. Thank you so much. And we begin a new dimension of this journey of this virus, and inshallah, God willing, the end of it, which is in vaccines. And today we're going to be talking about what it looks like for people of faith to believe in the scientists and the other healers who have developed these vaccines, the distinctive role that the distinctive attitudes that various faith communities are bringing to the vaccine, and the distinctive role of faith leaders and faith communities in advancing efforts for shalom, for wholeness, for deen and dunya, for the life of the spirit and our physical and material lives as well. So I'm going to first turn to my friend, Reverend Otis Moss III, who is not only senior pastor at Trinity United Church of Christ, but who did a great interview with Krista Tippett recently on the great Howard Thurman, and who was featured in Skip Gates's The Black Church on PBS with just a powerful, powerful opening sermon. Otis, my friend, it's been a while since we've seen each other physically, even though we live in the same city. I think about you often. I appreciate you. And I want to ask about how COVID has affected the lives of your congregation. And as a bit of a follow-up question, what role is your church, Trinity, but in some ways, Black churches in general, what role do you see them playing in this next phase of vaccinations and hopefully a nurturing back to a better and new, to not normal, but a better normal, a better way of being?
First, I want to say thank you, Eboo, for allowing me to be a part of this conversation with such incredible warriors who are doing amazing work in the faith community and organizing and just shining light in dark places. And you, who I have just such great respect for, and the work that you have been doing over the years is such a blessing. At Trinity United Church of Christ, right over on the south side of Chicago, we have witnessed the deep pain of this pandemic. Roughly about 90 or so funerals we could not do because of this pandemic. We are 1 degree of separation within this congregation. Everyone knows someone who has COVID, had COVID, or has passed as a result of COVID. So it became critical for us to educate the congregation about the challenges of this particular ailment and this particular disease. So we had to let people know about they need to get tested. We had to be able to communicate to people about all of the misinformation. I put it this way. I said, you would never go to Ray Ray, Pookie, or Leroy if you wanted someone to do some surgery on you. Please do not go to the barbershop or the salon to find out about information about COVID-19. I said that jokingly, but there was so much misinformation early on about this disease. And then if you take COVID-19 and you pair it with COVID-16-19, the original American pandemic, you put those two together and you have a disaster and a tragedy. And that's what we are witnessing. And so Black churches across the nation, I was just a part of a program yesterday, have been doing vaccination information and also actually vaccination location. And what we have found is when churches and trusted partners are partnering with public health officials, you have a higher level of people getting vaccinated. In Chicago, there's been a 70-30 flip. In other words, that vaccination in Black communities, primarily the people getting vaccinated are white. But yet when they did it at the churches, it flipped to 70-30, where 70% of the people getting vaccinated became African-American and 30% other, solely because of one, misinformation, two, because of the digital divide, and three, in terms of how public health officials that are caught within the minutiae of bureaucracy end up passing on information. So it becomes a community partnership. And it's not just vaccination, it's not just education, but doing a full service, holistic health. What does a healthy community look like? What does healthy policy look like? What does a healthy educational system look like? All of these are factors that affect life expectancy and the full health of an individual and a community. And it's important that we are connected to this type of engagement.
I appreciate that so much there. And I think that there's going to be this notion of COVID-16-19. I think you have injected a new dimension into American discourse with that coinage. Thank you for that. That is so powerful. And Otis, we're gonna be returning to this idea of the role that faith communities play in full service holistic health. One of the things I think many of us are aware of is that there's this potential to instrumentalize faith communities right now. You know, let's get the Black churches to do vaccination education without recognition of the massively important role that Black churches and other faith communities have played in holistic health for many, many years and can play for years to come. And I think that's a perfect segue to the work of Dr. Kameelah Rashad. One of the first PowerPoints that I saw on the role of religious identity and vaccination was Dr. Rashad's. It was passed on to me by our mutual friend, Janan Mohadra. I don't think you know that, Dr. Rashad, but 8 weeks ago, I think before virtually anybody was thinking about this, you were on it, right? With your group, the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition. Tell us what you were seeing. You know, tell us what you were seeing about the role that religious identity played in attitudes towards the vaccination, the vaccine, and the role that religious leadership, like yourself, can play in building trust for it and facilitating vaccinations.
I have to echo first the words of Reverend Otis and thanking you for really bringing this conversation to the fore. We're well into a second year of the pandemic. And so I want to extend my condolences, my prayers, just du'as for strength and mercy and grace for those who have lost members of their loved ones, their family members to COVID-19, and also for all of the other losses that we've all experienced as a result. It's been a really, really incredibly difficult year. And in some ways, we see the vaccine as kind of a silver lining, one of those sort of messages of hope, but we know that the work continues. And so with the work that I've been doing with the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition, it's really designed to bring to the fore the idea of pairing religion, race, identity, and healing, and understanding sort of the magnitude of this crisis for what we're going to have to deal with in the short term and the long term. Back in May 2020, it's hard to believe we're in 2021, we launched a national survey of those who identified as Black or African American, and were able to get almost 1,000 responses in a really, really short period of time, which let us know that people were really desiring in a space to talk about their experiences. And what we found was that those respondents, those participants in our survey represented all faiths, the major Abrahamic faiths, of course. And one of our findings that I think is extremely important for this discussion is how people are coping with the loss, coping with just the amount of perhaps despair that they're feeling. And one of those ways of coping is meaning-focused coping. And so understanding how faith, spirituality, connection to the divine, to the creator, can offer an opportunity for us to think about what can we make? How can we transform this misfortune, this adversity, into insight and understanding and wisdom? And so for those who are using meaning-focused coping, in order to understand the vaccine and the role that vaccination and religious leaders can play in getting more people access to this vaccination, is that meaning-focused coping is sort of the wheelhouse of religious leaders, right? Being able to provide that context, that spiritual understanding, and to say like, yes, Muslims believe, and we say that God does not place a burden on anyone greater than they can bear. And so our religious leadership, our faith leadership can help us think about what is the context of that burden and how this vaccination can help relieve that burden. There does not have to be sort of a dichotomy between religion and science. I think that the wonder that we find within the scientific world, for me, is manifestation of just the majesty of God. And so when we have this as a potential solution to begin to help us think about how we can slow this devastation in our communities, I think our religious leaders, really have an opportunity to provide, again, that context, to acknowledge and affirm the mistrust, the trauma that communities have experienced due to systemic racism in the healthcare system. And also to say, now here is an opportunity. What can we do with each other and for each other in order to sustain our communities and the lives of our community members? The last thing I'll say is that another way that religious leaders can be incredibly significant is also talking about this idea of spiritual bypassing, right? And so within, kind of our usage as Muslims, we tend to say, mashallah, subhanallah, alhamdulillah, giving praise to God. And there's also a way it's used for people to kind of, if they're struggling and overwhelmed by just all of the unresolved kind of emotional issues that the pandemic is bringing up, to say, well, I'll leave that all in the hands of God, right? But what we also know from our tradition is that our prophet has said, trust in Allah, trust in God, and tie your camel. And so what are those things that you can do within your control to protect your loved ones, to ensure that they are healthy, that they are able to connect and be with one another? And so all of that is within our power, given really the blessing of science and of vaccination. My brother is an engineer. He's been manufacturing vaccines for almost 10 years. And so when I see him, even within our sort of immediate family and community of loved ones, talk about what this means, it's pairing the spiritual and religious language and understanding with the benefit of science, which has always gone hand in hand with our understanding of ourselves in the world as Muslims. And so I'm really excited to see religious leaders really step into this role to work hand in hand with our scientific community, with our healthcare professionals, in order really to provide relief, understanding, context, and grace for those who are either confused or afraid. And that's what we're seeing a lot of.
Thank you for that. Jazakallah khair. That's so beautiful. Thank you, Kameelah. And because I'm a Muslim, I I resonate with so much of the language that you use, right? So much of the spirituality is common, but the distinctive language of Islam, when you say there's no dichotomy between religion and science, I think of the term ayah, which is commonly defined as a verse of the Quran, but it also means a sign, which is to say a sign in the world. And so the Quran says over and over again, it points to different parts of nature, birds and trees and lakes and rivers, and it says these are signs of God, right? And so there's this sense that it is effectively a Quranic command to explore the signs of God through his creation and to be in a way a fellow creator, as in someone who develops cures. You seek knowledge into China and you seek to be a mercy upon all the worlds. And we're in a situation right now where faith leaders and scientists really are on the same page. It's not always the case. Right now, we are on the same page. It's beautiful to hear the story about your brother who's an engineer and the work that he has done in saving lives through producing vaccines. So thank you for sharing that. If I could switch to my friend and mentor, Jim Wallis, who I've known since 1995, and I showed up as a college sophomore on his porch looking to have a conversation with somebody whose work had inspired me as a college student to really take the path of faith and social action. And every time you turn around, Jim is leading some kind of national effort to improve the lives, particularly of those who have been marginalized by COVID-16, 19, or by other forms of discrimination. And he is doing it again in his work with Faiths for Vaccines. So Jim, it's great to see you, friend. Congratulations for 50 years at Sojourners. Congratulations for your next steps at Georgetown. And in between, you have found yourself doing God's work and the nation's work with the Faiths for Vaccines group. Could you tell us a little bit about that? You're muted, friend.
Dr. Rashad just beautifully framed faith and science. So that's a foundation for this whole conversation. How do we reframe faith and science? So thank you for that. Otis Moss is one of my favorite pastors on the planet. Let me say that. And I love to tag team with Otis on anything that we can do. And Rabbi Hirschfield, I've heard great things about you. So I'm wonderfully glad to be with you. Eboo, I'm glad you started theologically and not just politically or practically, because when you talk about shalom, meaning wholeness, it means the restoration of relationships, right? Which is inclusive of justice. There is no healing without justice, and that's what Dr. Moss is saying to us today. This pandemic has been, to use this theological term, this pandemic has been revelatory. It has revealed and documented and verified the inequities in this society. And some of us have been saying these things for a long time, but this pandemic has verified everything that we've ever said. The racial, economic inequities in this country have been revealed by this pandemic and how it has impacted people of color in very disproportionate, powerful, dramatic ways. When Otis Moss talks about how many people in this congregation have been touched, 90 funerals that you couldn't have in the same way that you normally would. This is tremendous trauma and suffering. So this coalition that you mentioned that I've been able to be part of started when I got a call from Dr. Mohammed El-Sanusi, who was once the youth director of ISNA, the North Atlantic Islamic Association. And we've worked together before. And here's he calling, I've got the Islamic Medical Society ready to do vaccinations at our mosques. Can we do that? These are doctors and nurses that Kameelah knows well. And he said, yeah, but let's make it interfaith. So he gave me a call. And I said to him then, and I'll say it again now, when God speaks to one of us about something like this, it's likely that God is speaking to other people too, not just us. And so this coalition has come together. Still, the leadership point person is this young, wonderful, young Islamic leader named Mohammed El-Sanusi and his team, but it now includes the National Association of Evangelicals, the National Council of Churches, the Catholic Hospital Association, Barbara Williams Skinner's amazing network of Black churches all over the country, a lot of local AME church leaders in lots of places. And it's become a large coalition offering three things. One, as Reverend Otis was saying, clergy are already offering houses of worship as sites for vaccinations. It was happening before this coalition started. Many of them now are sort of projects of teaching us all this, sites. And it does turn things around, like the 70-30 change that Dr. Moss talked about, because these are trusted locations with people, clergy, who have trusted vocations. So it's a site, it's trusted, it's a messaging and messengers who are trusted and can reach out to people. And finally, it's at the core of what this administration is really trying to commit themselves to, which I admire, and they're falling short, which they know, which is the equitable distribution of these vaccines around the country. Right here in DC, Washington, DC, Ward 8, Black Ward, has not been vaccinated the way it should have been, where Ward 3 has been, right? So when you turn these vaccinations around, equity, and for Shalom, Eboo, equity is core to what Shalom has to mean. So we have been in conversation even yesterday with the White House, and what they're saying is it's not whether faith communities should be involved, it's how. So how do we do this in the most appropriate ways? We're not saying send us your vaccines and we'll put them in our church refrigerators and administer them with our volunteers. We're saying, no, we can create the spaces, the parish halls, the parking lots. We can do the message. We can get people to come, volunteers, parking attendants. We can provide that, but we need people to provide the wherewithal, the vaccinations, the logistics to make it happen. So we're partnering with, they want to partner with us at the federal and state and local level. And that's been sometimes difficult, as Reverend Moss knows, for some of our pilot projects have reached out to local health officials, and they weren't always quick and easy to respond. We're changing that. So the message will be, yes, collaborate with, work with houses of worship as vaccine sites. But let's choose ones that will help us with our equitable distribution of vaccines. And so I think that messaging with equity at the core is now, I think they're talking about co-creating a plan where this could be helped and assisted. And Eboo, you brought in a healthcare operation, Oak Street from Chicago. And when I got a call from Dr. Shakur, who is the chief White House vaccination director of this whole thing, he says, oh, I was Chicago health commissioner once. I know Mike, I know all those guys. Sure, we love to work with them. So once you start to connect, all these connections begin to fall into place. And so we're not asking the government to treat us as a constituency. Please take care of us too. No, we're saying we're making an offering. We're offering our assets, our networks, our clergy, our sites. We're offering that to vaccinate this country, but not just to heal from this pandemic, but to transform, as you said, our healthcare systems. Our healthcare systems have been infected by systemic racism, and that has to be healed. So how do we learn from this going forward of how to do holistic healthcare in this country going forward? We have to restore, we have to repair, we have to fix that. We can't just heal from this pandemic and act like everything's okay. Everything isn't okay. The pandemic has revealed that. So how do we use this as an example to transform our healthcare system? So in fact, they're inclusive of all of us. That's what we can do here, not just help in the immediate crisis, but take this thing forward to a much deeper level. It's part of our vocation.
building back better is not just a government plan, it's a theological imperative, right? And to have theology at the center of that. And look, part of the beauty of running an organization called Interfaith Youth Corps, or IFYC, is we proudly lead with the positive dimensions of faith communities, right? The community building dimensions of faith communities. And thank you for hovering a bit, Jim, on shalom and highlighting that it's not principally a quality of an individual, it's principally the quality of a community. And I'm glad we're turning to a rabbi next, because of course the term shalom comes from Judaism, the rabbinic tradition. So Brad and I have known each other for 12 or 15 years. I was joking with him the last time I saw him, he had a ponytail, and he had recently completed a terrific book called You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right. And he offered at the presentation that I saw him make a metaphor that I still use regularly, which is that religion is powerful. It's like a fire. It can heat your dinner or it can burn down your house. I think I made reference to that with the proper citation, Brad, just yesterday. So thank you for every single one of you has offered a little line that I will borrow and use like a DJ in my future performances and tellings with proper citations. But Brad, tell us as a rabbi, what are you seeing in Jewish communities? And Otis and Jim and Kameelah have each offered wisdom from their particular traditions. What is the particular wisdom from Judaism that we can learn from when it comes to the intersection of faith and science at the intersection of this vaccine, but really at the intersection of the theological focus on building back better?
Great, thank you, Eboo, for the brilliant questions. And before I do anything else, this reminds me why, selfishly, I participate in these panels, because my education continues. And I am both grateful and humbled by all of you, by your work in the world and your brilliance. And so I want to thank you publicly as one of your students, because how often in this polarized world does a rabbi get to thank two Muslims and two Christians, not just for being good, ethical, caring, brilliant people, but actually for being my spiritual and intellectual teachers. And I don't say it lightly. And Eboo, despite your modesty, I want to be very clear. You are every bit as much the leader of a faith-based congregation as any of us. And whether or not we have the rubrics or the categories that make it possible for hundreds of millions of people to embrace that, that's a sociological issue. It is not an issue, at least for me, in my soul, in my heart, in my mind, of the reality of what you and IFYC have done and continue to do. And so I'm very grateful to all of you. Look, I want to be clear. This is relatively easy if I look at the Jewish community, because Jews overwhelmingly embrace science and vaccination and the cause of equity and of access to vaccines. In fact, one could make the claim that Jews embrace science and vaccine and equity more than they embrace God and religion. But that's a separate conversation for another time. And it beguiles some religious leaders, and Dr. Rashad mentioned one of the ways to approach it, I think, and I believe that it's deeply in the tradition, that it's an artificial divide, it's a false dichotomy to imagine that people can embrace science and equity and the healing of people's bodies is somehow a separable category from God and faith and religion. So in that sense, this is pretty easy. And of course, there are exceptions in the Jewish community, as there are in every community. Most notably, if one looks at the press, it's going to be in segments of the ultra-Orthodox, or in Hebrew, Haredi, which, although it doesn't work as well in English, literally means to be awestruck or to be a Quaker. So it turns out there are two kinds of Quakers. There's the kind of Quakers most Americans know, and there are the Quakers, although it's a term they wouldn't use, of those ultra-Orthodox Jews, in men in black hats and women in, wigs. But even there, the issue really is not resistance to vaccines. The issue is not resistance to science. The issue is much more a matter of trust in authorities and the institutions that are at the forefront of sending out those vaccines into the world. And I think that's really, really important, because as much as we can create theological framings that we, and here the we is those of us on this seminar, who I'm guessing largely agree. I mean, there have been so many points of agreement between all of us that we could easily, well, it ought to be easy. At which point I would say, well, it depends which we. Because for the we, whichever religious communities, and that doesn't trust the institutions and doesn't trust the agencies and the authorities that have sent vaccine and vaccination out into the world, while it's true that a theological framing will help, my experience is, with the best of intentions, and I'm including myself, we all tend to frame things in theologies that work for us, share them with others, and then say, now do you see it? And of course, the answer is no. And not because they're stupid or bad, but because their theological premises are not ours. And so one of the real challenges is, how do you combine a massive dose of intellectual and theological humility with an equally massive dose of passionate engagement and activism? Because all the theological framings in the world won't help if they're not the other person's theology. And if I'm really honest, there is no theology, however artful I can come up with, I won't speak for anyone else, that doesn't have an equally good one that's the polar opposite. And once I accept that, I know that there is no master narrative theologically that will suddenly convince other people, because I don't think the issue is fundamentally theological. It is, as I said, fundamentally, no pun intended, a matter of trust. And trust building is very different than policy advocacy, even though I deem them both to be sacred categories. Advocating for better policy that reflects what I believe to be, what I believe, that's all I can say, God's will for the world, as I best understand it, I think is holy work. But I also accept that that's often diametrically opposed to trust building. Because trust building, whether it's the work of Paul Ziek or Tyreen Mitchell, or even Pete Buttigieg's book that shares the name Trust, works best when it's independent of advocacy for a particular conclusion. It works best when we are willing to go to those with whom we disagree most and show up for each other on the terms of the other. And that doesn't mean everyone has to do it with everybody. Nobody can. But it means we have to be very careful, I think, about the difference between advocating for the policies which we deem sacred and doing the trust building, which is typically best done, and it's hard when it's disconnected from advocacy, when it is about pure presence and relationality, even when that means building relationships with people we may think are completely crazy or worse. But there is no shortcut to building trust. And the interesting thing is, because you did get the quote right about faith like a fire, which can either cook our meals or burn down our homes. And the second half is, of course, that means the issue isn't the fire, the issue is those who wield it. We have to decide, how do we want to use faith? Do we want to use it to show people the light? Or do we want to use it to give ourselves the courage to build trust with people who may never see the light as we see it? I can't decide which is right, but I know those two are different, and we've got to be mindful, especially because I know of no form of community or personal experience that can build trust or undermine trust like religion. People can gather in communities of faith and experience the capacity to trust people when they know intellectually it makes no sense to trust those people. And they can also, and dare to do it. To trust that which isn't trustable, because that's what faith allows us to do. Or we can gather in religious community and it can affirm and confirm why we don't trust those people, whoever those people are. And we know that right now in this country, faith communities and houses of worship are being used in both ways. And it's not a matter of right versus left, or Jewish or Christian or Muslim. We can go to progressive communities that have mobilized the word of God to teach profound distrust of conservatives, and certainly in the reverse, at least as much, if not more. And it's not the domain of any one particular tradition. And so I think really the spiritual work here for me is to appreciate the work of trust building ahead of policy advocacy, if ironically I want to see policies change. Because short of coercion, which I'm not a big fan of, the only tool left is to build relationships and trust beyond current boundaries. And that's not informational. And then I'm going to shut up, I promise. Especially in a moment as tempting as it is. We'll just give them the right information. Truth is, I would suggest that actually the challenge we live in at this moment is not that we lack information. It's that we have too much information. For the first time, maybe in 10,000 years of human history, the fundamental challenge is not gaining access to information. It's developing the wisdom to know how to sift through it. And to do exactly what you said, Eboo, and what our current president ran on, the promise of building back better, which in my view is not a terrible way to summarize any of the traditions we follow. To build back better and do it with both the passion to advocate for what we believe and the humility to appreciate the multiple understandings of better, which would allow us to build trust where currently there is nothing but mistrust.
Thanks, Brad. You know, I'm with your focus on trust, I'm reminded that the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, that the term that people would call him, even before he was publicly announced as God's prophet, was Al-Amin, which means the trustworthy, right? And part of what that indicates is there's a beyond a tribal mentality there. There's a sense that this person's dignity and sense of decency and generosity, it is widely recognized as trustworthy. And so thank you for lifting that up as a sacred value. And it's, I think one of the interesting spiritual challenges of our time is, what does it look like to be trusted by people with whom you might disagree and who may disagree with you, right? You may even vote different ways. You might have fundamental disagreements, but you look them in the eye and you say, this is good for you. And they believe you because they have a deep sense of your dignity. I think that's a powerful reminder and an opportunity. So I want to take that ethic into this next big question. I want to direct it specifically to Otis, because he's going to have to leave us a little bit early. Otis, I'm deeply struck by Jim's formulation. Black churches are trusted locations with trusted vocations, and your data point that when Black churches serve as locations of vaccinations, it's not white folks on the north side of Chicago making their way to the south side for vaccines. It's Black folks getting the vaccine at a site that they trust, right? And it's so interesting that the same individual who sits in a doctor's office as a patient might not listen to that doctor's advice, but when they sit in your pews, Otis, as a congregant, they trust you, and they will, in effect, do the same act in a different frame. So here's my big question, right? There's a great article about you recently in the Chicago Sun-Times about the role that Trinity has played in the physical and spiritual wellness of its congregants around nutrition, around heart disease, etc. Let's say, God willing, that we vaccinate every American between now and June, and the emergency is done. If you had a meeting with President Biden and Vice President Harris, and they were to say to you, Otis, what's the role that your church and faith communities in general, I'm going to ask everybody some version of this, right? What's the role that your church and faith communities in general can play in health outcomes? Tell us what you can do. You can't perform surgery, on the pulpit, but tell us what you can do and what are the resources that you would need to do that? What would you say?
That's a great question, Eboo. And I would say that faith communities have to be an anchor for holistic community development. And let me explain that. I'll give you a very small example. There are groups of churches in Chicago that made decisions to do gardens. As a result of doing gardens, something happened. 1, intergenerational communication. 2, it reduced the level of violence in communities because you built relationships with individuals. Because remember, we need to begin to think through when we talk about public safety, it should be public health. We don't need to frame it as policing. That's a health issue. The next piece is that within churches, especially your Pentecostal, your small church communities, when the elder in the church, and I'm not talking about the pastor, I'm talking about there's usually an elder woman who runs the church. Let me just say that, okay? When the elder makes particular decisions and says, for example, we are going to now purchase from this local farmer, from this local farmer's market, all of a sudden something changes. We had an experience when we started our farmer's market where people did not, some people didn't, they were looking at squash and they were like, well, yeah, that's nice, but what do you do with it? I'm used to packaged food. So you have this anchor that can be in the heart of the community, ever seeking the community's heart, that can allow people to imagine differently, to use their imagination to see holistic health differently. So from what I eat to what I grow, to viewing what is policing as public health. And if I view it from public health, then I raise different questions when it's public health. When I look at education as public health, I raise different questions. When I see incarceration as a health issue and not as this issue of retribution, but of redemption and restoration, it changes the outcomes. The faith community can give new language to the civic community, language of restoration, redemption, of love, of empowerment, of community, language that politicians are very skittish about using. When was the last time you heard about a politician saying, forgive me, unless they did something really bad?
And then only sometimes.
Then only sometimes. That we have a new language that we have to put in the public sphere. And all of the faith traditions bring this language to the table of how do we become fully human.
Otis, what strikes me about this is I think what you're talking about is a fresh and new chapter in a long-standing American story, because so much of the language that is actually used in the civic community is faith language. We've just forgotten its faith language. Beloved community, cathedral of humanity, almost chosen people, better angels of our nature, city on a hill, right? This is all faith language. It is scriptural language. Muslims will often refer to America as a new Medina at its best, as the city that welcomed the prophet and his companions after they were hounded out of Mecca, right? And I love the, you didn't say, my church can run this one more program. You centered a faith community within a polity, and you talked about its relationship with everything from public safety to nutrition to community economics, right? Buying from that local farmer is not only how food is grown and what people eat, it's also how economics happens, right? And so this, this kind of community notion of shalom can easily have a faith community or faith communities at the center. I want to turn for a minute to Dr. Rashad and ask, you not only have launched the Black Muslim COVID Coalition, but you've run the Muslim Wellness Foundation for a long time. None of the people, including and especially you, Kameelah, are new to this. This is not like COVID happened and all of a sudden you got interested in health. It's much more like you've been paying attention to the intersection of religion and health for a long time, and we are finally paying attention to you, right? What promise do you think this moment has for interfaith cooperation on health and on the kind of expansive notion of health and wellness and shalom that Otis mentioned?
I think this is such a tremendous opportunity because what we're going to see is that while this is a health crisis, it's a crisis of all of those inequities being revealed to a greater number of people. This is also in some ways an existential crisis that people are asking themselves about belonging, about mutual aid, about who do I belong to, right, when I experience this kind of suffering and despair. And so in these moments, people are turning, right, kind of returning to that which grounded them for a long period of time and perhaps at different points in time. But I think what it offers us now is an opportunity to widen that net and to think about how we integrate religion and spirituality and health such that it's not just, well, if you're going to pray, go over there, right? And if you're going to see the doctor, you go here, right? Ideally, folks should be able to access this menu of health, right, in one location, right? And so what does that mean? If we're talking about your spiritual nourishment, your physical nourishment, your emotional nourishment, how profound would it be for individuals to see that, one, all of the professionals are on the same page. We're supporting one another, right? We're complementing one another's work. And so if someone is coming to me with a psychological ailment, I'm going to ask them about their connection to the creator or not. How do they see the world and their relationship to humanity? I'm going to ask them about, are you getting enough exercise, right? What does your diet look like? And so once we connect mind, body, spirit, we allow for others to give themselves permission, right, to say that I should not compartmentalize my own life, right, when the world is expanding opportunities for me to be fully integrated and to be fully whole. And so what I think this offers us now is, when we're talking about government, we're talking about politics, civic engagement, it's usually these crisis points where we see a resurgence in recognition of the role of faith. And what I really want to see is that once whatever this moment becomes next, that we don't wait for another crisis to demonstrate how integral the religious and faith communities are in how we understand our lives in this country. And so as a psychologist, I talk about post-traumatic growth, right? This period of time, this COVID-19 has been incredibly traumatic. And I want us to use that language because of the number of transitions and losses that we've experienced. But there's also post-traumatic growth, right? How do we gain wisdom and insight and a new way of being from this experience we've all shared? And that includes pulling in all of those individuals, leaders, to sit down at the table and to say, honestly, I need you. For my work to be effective and to be meaningful, I need to sit hand in hand with you. I need to appreciate your work. I need to appreciate the values and perspectives that you bring. And we can come to some shared understanding because all of our roles essentially is to serve. And so once we can do that together, I think that we are more powerful. We are absolutely just opens up again those possibilities for this work to be sustainable over a long term, right? Not just this time, but so that when we're looking back 10 years, 20 years, we can say that this was a turning point.
So I have to say, Kameelah, my terrific colleagues at IFYC, part of what some of them are doing are listening very closely for powerful nuggets that can be shared, and every other line that you say is one of those nuggets. So I'm just going to name a couple of them, right? How do we transform this misfortune into insight? How do we practice meaning-focused coping? And how do we engage in post-traumatic growth? I mean, that's really powerful. I could see Otis is like, I'm done with my next sermon, right? Like so thank you so much for that beautiful wisdom. And it's so clear that everybody on this panel has been thinking about this for years, right? And like so many other things, it's you prepared for the crisis before the crisis hit, and we are now preparing not only to engage and hopefully solve the crisis, but to build in a way that makes crises like these a lot less traumatic and challenging in the future. So I'm going to turn slightly different questions to Jim and Brad, and we've got about 5 minutes here. So Jim, in a couple minutes, you actually do speak with senior people in the administration on a regular basis, and you've done it for years and years and years and years. This isn't a hypothetical for you, Jim. When you speak with Susan Rice or Vice President Harris or President Biden, and they say to you in August, hey, Jim, that faith coalition that you played a central role in, that Brad Hirschfield and Otis Moss and Kameelah Rashad were all a part of, how does that faith coalition play a role in a health and wellness strategy for America over the next 100 years? It's a version of the question I asked to Kameelah and to Otis. I'd love to hear your answer to President Biden on that.
Well, this conversation reminds me of the Chinese symbol for crisis is the two symbols in Chinese for danger and opportunity. So people turn to us in the crisis because we can respond. Now, practically, they're trying to race against variants of this virus. That's what makes this not theoretical. Right now, we have to vaccinate enough people before the variants outrun the virus. That's very practical. So when Rabbi talked about the trust, young people don't walk by our congregations asking, I wonder what they believe in there. They're asking, what are they doing? What are they doing? So in response to a crisis, we do what we do. Then they say, why do you do what you do? Well, let me tell you what we believe. That's how what we do is the first response. And then we say what we believe. So Reverend Moss says a test of faith is, you might also say, the common good, human flourishing, community development. So in fact, if we respond in a crisis in ways even the White House says that's really helpful to what we're trying to do, then we have a real voice in what's next. What's next? What's next to talk about human flourishing and equitable medical systems, that health is in fact, healing means justice. So it means all the things that, I mean, there are people, as Rabbi Moss knows, in the Black Lives Movement, that are looking at churches and saying, well, we're unchurched. We've been kind of unchurched. We're not against all this, but I remember a conversation with Ferguson leaders and Reverend Moss, where they said, you know, we want you to help us. We want to help you, but what risks are we willing to take? And Reverend Moss jumped all over that and said, that's indeed the question. What risks are we willing to take for the sake of what we believe? If we believe these things, a young generation looking to us for the courage to act on the things we say we believe. That changes what we do, and it's transforming, as the Sun-Times article, which I haven't read yet, which I'll read, what a church is doing on the South Side, which creates trust and then authority for saying, in answer to your question, Susan Rice, what's next? Here's some examples we have of what's next. So we're not saying what we believe. We've done this. You like what we've done. Now we're saying we want to have a voice in what you all do next. And I think faith leaders have supported this big bill. It's being voted on today, big bill that is in fact delivering relief from suffering and economic distress. And they're already saying now, what's next? Because what's next is always the question we have to ask them and be a part of.
Yeah, Jim, I have to say, I remember in our time together on the President Obama's Faith Council, you would talk about completing the war on poverty from the 1960s, like completing that great society transformation. And you would talk about bills like this, and it happened two administrations later, but we're about to see perhaps, you know, the greatest poverty fighting bill since the 1960s pass. And there's your fingerprints are on that, and your blessings as well. And so I'm just proud to be in the White House when you were whispering that in President Obama's ear, and it took a couple of presidents, but here we are. Brad, take us out, friend. I'm serious, right? You got 2 minutes left. All religions are communities of memory. Judaism in particular is a tradition of memory. What story do we want our grandchildren telling of us and our role in this crisis and our role in a new social architecture? What story do we want them telling of us?
So it's as old as Moses channeling God. Behold, today I set before you life and death. Choose life. And I use that scripture particularly because there are real battles we're going to have along religious lines about what it means to choose life. I don't choose that accidentally. But if people actually could begin to appreciate about each other that even when we are not aiming for the same end result, we are in the same game. And it is a game in which the faiths we follow are not ends in of themselves. They are means to the kind of human flourishing, the kind of wholeness, the shalomness, the salamness that we have talked about from the very beginning. And for me, it's very simple. The fastest growing religious group in this country are the nuns. And that's not Catholic religious women. It's N-O-N-E-S. But contrary to the sociologists who would tell us that means they want nothing from religion, I couldn't think they're more wrong. For me, the nuns are the people who, when presented with those little boxes, are checking none of the above. The contents of my soul, of my aspirations as a human being, are bigger than any one box. And here's the irony. If we, because my message is to us, it's never to a them, it's got to be, we have the greatest control over ourselves. But I think that Jim is completely right. Imagine if religious leaders and religious communities have the courage to say, we're not in the business of being in this business. We are in the business of building community to serve humanity. And our litmus test will be every time you leave our community, do you leave with a little more understanding of others, a little more hope in the future, and a little more sense that you are as beautiful as you would like to believe. Because whether you believe in God or not, we can affirm that story that we're all created in the image of God. Whether it's a God we believe in or a God we don't, I don't care. I believe in that story. I also believe in God. But more than fighting about theology, I want to fight for that story. And then simply ask it every day when I wake up and every morning when I go to bed. Do I feel a little more in the image of that God? And did I do anything to contribute to even one more person feeling that they too are a little bit in the image of that God? We do that. I can't tell you exactly what the future will bring, but I know our great-great-grandchildren will look back on this tragedy and they'll say that we, their great-great-grandparents, we made the most of it, given what couldn't be changed. And that feels like a pretty big blessing to me.
That's what it means to be a witness. That's what it means to be a mercy upon all the worlds. That's what it means to be the light of Jesus on earth, whatever it is, whatever your tradition is. Thank you for the inspiration. Thank you to everybody who was a part of this today. More resources for those who are interested at ifyc.org, and to all, Jazakallahu for my God give you goodness. Thank you to the panelists.